My name is Daniel Hartley and I am 44 years old. 4 months ago I sat in the third row of a law office in Savannah, Georgia, while a lawyer named Bernard Okafor read my father's will aloud to a room of people who believed they already knew how the story ended. They were wrong. The room was arranged the way these rooms always are: formal, temperature-controlled, the kind of quiet that exists because the building itself understands it is housing a serious occasion. My mother sat in the front row beside my older brother Colin, both of them in black. Colin had his hands folded in his lap. My mother had a handkerchief she wasn't using yet but held the way people hold things they expect to need. Two of my father's business associates sat along the wall. A cousin I hadn't seen in 15 years took a chair near the back and kept glancing at his phone with the barely concealed impatience of someone who had driven a long distance to find out whether it was worth driving. I sat in the third row alone. Not because I was excluded from the front. Because I had chosen the third row deliberately. I had learned a long time ago the value of positioning yourself where you can see everything clearly without being at the center of it. Bernard Okafor opened a leather portfolio. He had a practiced, unhurried quality that I respected. Men who read wills for a living develop a specific kind of neutrality. They have seen too many rooms like this one to be surprised by what happens in them. He read the standard sections first. The recitals. The executor clause. The specific bequests: my father's watch collection to Colin, his fishing equipment to the cousin who had already gone back to checking his phone, his interest in the family business to my mother in perpetuity. Then Bernard Okafor cleared his throat. He said, "The following section represents a departure from the standard distribution clause. Per your father's explicit instruction, and in fulfillment of a commitment he made in writing 28 years ago, I am required to read a document in full before the estate distribution is finalized." My mother turned slightly in her chair. Colin went very still. Bernard Okafor reached into the portfolio and produced a second document. Not the will itself. Something older. Pages that had been photocopied and preserved but still showed the faint evidence of their age, the particular fragility of paper that has been handled, folded, and carried. He began to read. The handwriting, transferred in the photocopy onto clean legal paper, was mine. I was 16 when I wrote it. Before we get into this, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. To understand what was in that letter, you have to understand what my family was. Not the version that appeared in the Savannah social pages when my father's company turned 30. The actual version. The one that lived between the walls of a large house on Abercorn Street and had been preserved, like so many things in that house, in a form that made it presentable from the outside. My father, William Hartley, built Hartley Construction from a single crew and 2 contracts in 1978 into a mid-sized regional firm that by the time I was born was doing enough business to qualify as legacy. He was a large man in every sense: physically imposing, professionally respected, socially dominant. He filled rooms with the specific weight of someone who believes their bigness is the natural order of things rather than a transaction. My mother, Catherine, was the architecture of the family's social life. Charity boards. Church committees. The annual Hartley holiday party that people in Savannah talked about the following year. She was elegant and careful and had learned early that managing the perception of the family was her primary function, and she executed that function with the precision of someone who understood that perception, in their world, was not separate from reality but actually constituted it. Colin was 3 years older than me and had come out of the womb already understanding what my father wanted. He was aggressive where I was methodical. Loud where I was precise. He played the sports my father valued, pursued the business track my father envisioned, and delivered every performance review of himself with the instinctive fluency of a man who was born knowing his audience. I was not that man. I was the second son in a family that had already satisfied its legacy requirement. I was interested in architecture, specifically the design side, not construction, not the business, not the contracts and the crews and the commercial machinery my father had built, but the actual art of making spaces that served people well. My father called this drawing pictures. He said it in a tone that treated creativity as a character flaw. He said it consistently enough that for a long time I believed him. That is the damage certain fathers do. Not one dramatic wound. 1,000 small permissions to believe you are insufficient. I was a quiet child and a quieter teenager, which my parents interpreted as passivity. It was not passivity. It was observation. I had learned early that the Hartley household operated on a specific currency: performance, achievement, visible ambition, and that my denomination of that currency was not accepted at the family exchange rate. I was good at school in ways my father didn't measure. Top marks in art and design, strong in mathematics when it applied to spatial reasoning, mediocre at the team sports that were the social grammar of my father's regard. I had one close friend, Marcus, who was also quiet and also interested in things that didn't register as impressive to our fathers and who has been one of my closest friends for 30 years now. I had a teacher named Mr. Galloway who taught drafting and technical drawing and who told me once, quietly, after looking at a building design I had done for a class project, "This is genuinely exceptional, Daniel. You should know that." I went home and tried to tell my father. He was on the phone. He held up one finger in the universal gesture for not now. I waited. When he finished the call he said, "What?" I said I'd drawn a building plan that Mr. Galloway said was exceptional. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Galloway is a drafting teacher in a public school. When you get a compliment from someone running a real operation, come talk to me." Then he went back to his paperwork. That was the economy I grew up in. Admiration counted only if it came from a source my father recognized as legitimate. Mr. Galloway did not qualify. I did not qualify for measuring anything. The summer I turned 15, my father announced that Colin would be joining the company after college in a management track position that had been designed, it was clear, specifically for him. This was not a surprise. The succession plan for Hartley Construction had been visible since Colin could hold a tape measure. What was a surprise, at least to me, was what my father said at that same dinner table while passing the potatoes. "Daniel, you'll need to find your own path. I can't run a family business with someone who has no interest in it." My mother said nothing. Colin said nothing. I said nothing. 4 words landed and stayed: find your own path. Which in context meant, you are not part of what we're building here. It meant the inheritance of legacy, the company, the position, the family identity built around Hartley Construction had a single destination. Colin. And I had just been officially redirected. I was 15 years old. I did not cry at the table. I ate my dinner and cleared my plate and went upstairs and sat on my bed for a long time. Not devastated exactly. More like a person who has been told something they already suspected and now must decide what to do with confirmed information. What I decided, that night, was to write it down. Not a diary entry. Something more specific. I had been reading about architecture programs at universities, secretly, the way I did most of my serious reading in that house, quietly, without announcing it, not wanting my interest subjected to my father's review before I had decided it was real enough to defend. I had found a program at Georgia Tech that had a full scholarship competition for rising high school juniors. The scholarship required an application essay and a portfolio and, for finalists, a letter of commitment from a parent or guardian. I knew, with the practical certainty that comes from paying attention to your own family, that my father would not write that letter. He might not even refuse dramatically. He might just fail to respond. Which in some ways was worse. So at 15, going on 16, I started writing my own letter. Not a fake one. Not a forgery. I wrote a letter to my father. A real one. The kind I would never be able to say to his face because the house did not have the room for that conversation and he did not have the patience for it. I wrote everything in it. What it felt like to be the second son in a house where the definition of worth was too narrow to include me. What I understood about what he had built and why he was proud of it and why I was also proud of it even though it wasn't mine to inherit. What I wanted to build instead. why I believed the thing I wanted to build was worth building. And what I needed from him, not money, not approval exactly. Just acknowledgement. Just one sentence from a man who had made me feel invisible for years that said he saw me. I wrote it across 3 nights. 9 pages. I rewrote sections until the language was precise enough to say what I meant without sounding like what I was, which was a 16-year-old boy terrified of his own father's indifference. Then I folded it and addressed the envelope and walked it to his study and slid it under the door. If you've ever written the letter you were too afraid to say out loud, drop a fire emoji in the comments. And if you think my father kept that letter for 28 years for a reason, type karma. He never acknowledged the letter. Not directly. Not at breakfast the next morning, not at dinner, not in the weeks that followed. My father moved through the household as he always had, large, purposeful, contained. If the letter had unsettled him, he gave nothing away. If it had moved him, he buried the evidence. I told myself he hadn't read it. It was easier. I applied to Georgia Tech without his letter of commitment. Marcus's mother, a woman who had never met a bureaucratic obstacle she couldn't charm into submission, wrote one instead and signed it as a family friend of sufficient standing to satisfy the requirement. The scholarship committee accepted it. I made the finalist round. I presented my portfolio in Atlanta on a Thursday in March while my father was at a job site in Hinesville and my mother was at a board meeting and Colin was at lacrosse practice. I won the scholarship. I called my mother from the lobby of the Georgia Tech Architecture building. She said, "Oh, Daniel, that's wonderful." In the background I could hear the sounds of wherever she was. She said she was proud of me. She said she had to go but we would celebrate this weekend. We did not celebrate that weekend. My father acknowledged the scholarship at dinner 4 days later. He said, "I heard you got money for art school." I said it was an architecture program. He said, "Right," and went back to his meal. Colin said congratulations in a tone that was sincere enough. My mother nodded and changed the subject. That was the celebration. I left for Georgia Tech at 18 with the scholarship and a quiet, settled certainty that I was no longer trying to become something my family would recognize. I was becoming something else. Something real on its own terms, without reference to the Hartley Construction legacy or my father's definition of worth or the dinner table where most things that mattered to me had been quietly, efficiently set aside. College was the oxygen that houses like ours withhold. I did not hide in it. I worked. Architecture is a discipline that demands everything: the analytical precision of engineering, the spatial imagination of art, the human empathy of design done honestly. I was built for it in a way I had never been built for anything my family valued, and finding that fit was the most clarifying experience of my life. Professors marked my work. Peers asked for my opinion. A studio critic in my 3rd year stopped a class review to hold up one of my drawings and explain to the group what it was doing and why it worked. That was the moment I understood Mr. Galloway had been right. And my father had been wrong. Not wrong about everything. He was not a wrong man in simple terms. He had built something real and he had built it with genuine intelligence and force of will, and I had inherited some of that intelligence and force of will and was currently applying it to a field he considered decorative. He was wrong about what worth looked like outside his specific frame. He was wrong about me. The hardest part was not being estranged from him after college. I came home for holidays. I was civil, even warm in the limited register available. I worked at a firm in Atlanta after graduation, then started my own small practice at 28 when I had enough of a client base to justify the risk. I built the practice slowly and well, the way I did most things. By the time I was in my mid-30s, Hartley Architecture was modest in size and excellent in reputation, the kind of firm that wins awards for civic buildings and school renovations and community centers that serve actual neighborhoods rather than corporate ambition. My father visited my office once. Colin brought him as part of a day in Atlanta that included a baseball game. My father walked through the office, looked at the framed projects on the wall, said nice work in the tone he reserved for things he did not know how to evaluate, and left for the game. Nice work. After 20 years. Nice work. I went back to my desk and I kept building anyway. The estrangement from the wool was not dramatic. The most significant family damages rarely are. They accumulate in quiet increments the way erosion works, not a single flood, just water moving in one persistent direction until the ground changes shape. When my father's health declined, the logistics of the family gathered themselves in the way they always had. Colin managed the business transition. My mother managed the household and the social calendar of illness, who was told, in what terms, with what emphasis on dignity and privacy. I was informed. Present when invited. Present sometimes when not invited because I was still his son and my presence at certain moments was not optional regardless of how I was categorized elsewhere. My father had 2 strokes in 3 years. The second one was serious enough that the recovery was partial rather than complete. He lost mobility on his left side. He was slower. Quieter. Some of the large, imposing certainty he had always moved through the world with became uncertain, which is what serious illness does regardless of the person's net worth or family legacy or construction empire. During those years I visited more. Not because the relationship had healed. Because he was diminishing and whatever I had needed from him in my life had long since been built by other means, and what remained was just the fact of him, an aging man who was my father and would be my father until one of us was finished. We had one honest conversation. One. Out of 44 years. It was a Sunday afternoon in the spring before he died. He was in the chair by the window in his study, the same study where I had slid the letter under the door 28 years before. My mother had gone to church. Colin was at a soccer game with his children. I had driven down from Atlanta and arrived to find him alone with a book in his lap he wasn't reading. We sat for a while without talking. My father and I had always been able to sit without talking in a way that felt less like companionship and more like 2 people observing a ceasefire. Then he said, without preamble, without looking up from the unread book, "I kept your letter." I did not speak. "All of it," he said. "I read it that same night. I've read it several times since." Outside the window, a neighbor was mowing their lawn. The sound of the mower came and went as it moved in rows. "Why did you never say so?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought maybe he hadn't heard me or had decided not to answer. Then, because answering would have meant admitting the question was fair. That sentence sat in the room with all the weight of its honesty. I did not fill the silence around it. I let it be exactly what it was. He said, "Before I left that day, you built something real." 4 words. Not 9 pages. Not the letter I had written. Not an apology that accounted for everything. But the 4 words he had never said in any register during my childhood. He died 4 months later on a Wednesday morning in November. I drove to Savannah the next day. My mother hugged me for a long time. Colin shook my hand. The house was full of the particular organized grief of a family that is also managing a sequence of logistical and social obligations and cannot separate the mourning from the administration. I have to pause here. At the reading of the will, when Bernard Okafor announced there was a letter attached to the distribution, what do you think happened? Option A, my father had written a letter apologizing and changing the will. Option B, my father had preserved my letter from when I was 16 and built something into the will around it. Option C, the letter was from my mother, not my father, changing the original terms. Drop your answer in the comments. The answer was B. But the shape of it was more specific, and more quietly calculated, than a simple gesture of apology or recognition. Bernard Okafor read my letter. My letter. The 9 pages I had written at 16 and slid under a door in the belief that they had vanished. He read all of it, not quickly, in the unhurried voice of someone executing a legal obligation, and the effect in that room was extraordinary in the specific way that quiet things are sometimes more powerful than loud ones. My mother went still in a way that was different from composed. Colin stopped looking at the window and looked at his hands. The cousin near the back put his phone in his pocket. The letter said everything I had not been able to say at 15. It named the dinner table where I was told to find my own path. It named the scholarship my father had called money for art school. It named the thing I wanted to build and why I believed in it and what I had needed from him. It was not an angry letter. That was the part that made it harder to hear, I think. It was careful and specific and honest, and honesty from a 16-year-old written in full awareness of what it costs to be honest with a parent who does not reward it is a particular kind of difficult to listen to. When Bernard Okafor finished, the room held the silence for longer than was comfortable. Then he continued with the will. The primary assets, the house, the business interests, the investment accounts, went to my mother as planned. Colin received his designated distributions. A charitable bequest went to a local scholarship foundation. Then Bernard Okafor said, "To my son Daniel, I leave the following. First, the full originals of the above letter, to be returned to him as they were written. Second, a separate trust in the amount of $800,000, designated specifically for the expansion of Hartley architecture, to be used at Daniel's sole discretion. Third, and last, I ask that the following sentence be read aloud in the presence of whoever is gathered." He looked down at the page. "You built something real. I should have said so sooner. I am saying so now." The same 4 words from the study window. Put into the legal record of his estate. Witnessed. Notarized. Permanent. My mother was crying silently, the handkerchief finally in use. Colin was looking at me with an expression I did not have a name for immediately and then recognized as something he had probably not expected to feel in this room. Something close to shame. I looked at Bernard Okafor and thanked him for reading it carefully. He nodded once. He understood. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happened in that room after the reading was not what any of us had scripted. After the formal portion concluded, Bernard Okafor stepped out to give the family privacy, which is standard practice in these situations and which in this situation meant 5 people in a climate-controlled room with 28 years of rearranged understanding between them. My mother reached me first. I want to describe this accurately rather than sentimentally. She was not racked with guilt in the way that would make this story feel neater. She was a woman in her 70s who had just sat in a chair and heard her 16-year-old son's most honest moment read back to her at her husband's will reading, and the thing on her face was not guilt so much as recognition. The particular recognition of someone seeing clearly for the first time something they have been looking at indirectly for years. She took my hand. She said, "I knew he kept the letter. He never told me what was in it." I said, "Now you know." She nodded. Then, with the careful honesty of someone choosing between the comfortable answer and the true one, I should have asked. That sentence cost her something. I received it accordingly. Colin took longer to cross the room. He was not, to his credit, performing anything. He stood at the window for several minutes while our mother and I talked, the kind of standing that is its own processing time, and then he came over and said, without preamble, "I didn't know he did that to you." The dinner table. The art school comment. He paused. I heard it. I didn't know what it cost. I said, "You were the designated heir. That's not your fault." He said, "No. But watching and saying nothing was." That was honest. More honest than I had expected from Colin in that room or possibly any room. We did not become close that afternoon. Closeness is not a conclusion, it is a process, and we were at the beginning of one, not the end. But we began. Carefully. With enough honesty in the room to make beginning feel like something other than performance. The business associates offered their condolences and left quickly, carrying the particular discomfort of people who had witnessed more than they bargained for. The cousin left without the windfall he'd probably imagined and without comment, which was the best outcome available for everyone. I drove back to Atlanta the following morning with the original 9 pages in a folder on the passenger seat. I did not read them on the drive. I had spent 28 years assuming they had been discarded. I was not ready to read them as objects that had been carried. as pages that had been handled and returned to and preserved across 2 strokes and a declining memory and a death and a lawyer's portfolio. I pulled over once, on I-16 outside Macon, and I held the folder and I looked at the traffic passing and I thought about a 16-year-old boy in a house on Abercorn Street sliding 9 pages under a door in the belief that being honest was worth the risk of being ignored. He was right. It was worth it. Just not on the timeline he expected. Most right things aren't. The trust changed my practice in real terms. Not instantly, real change never is. But materially and meaningfully. I had been running Hartley Architecture as a small firm of 8 for 6 years. Good work. Respected work. Work that won the kind of awards that matter in professional circles and generate the kind of client referrals that sustain a practice without requiring it to compromise on what it takes on. But small. Constrained by capital in the specific way that design practices are when you are choosing between the project you believe in and the project that keeps the lights on. The trust removed that constraint. I hired 3 additional staff in the first year. I took on 2 civic projects I would previously have had to decline, a community health center in a neighborhood that had been without one for a decade, and a public library renovation in a small Georgia town whose library had not been updated since 1974. I began a partnership with a local university's architecture school that brought graduate students into the practice on design fellowships that my father's trust essentially funded. These were not gestures. These were the natural expansion of work I had been doing with whatever resources I had. What made it strange, occasionally, was the source. My father had built Hartley Construction on commercial contracts, infrastructure projects, the efficient delivery of buildings that served business purposes. He had valued utility and scale and a kind of visible productivity that could be measured in square footage and revenue. And now his money was funding a library in a small town and a health center in an underserved neighborhood, exactly the kind of work he had probably never considered when he said nice work in my Atlanta office 15 years ago. Marcus, who had been my friend for 3 decades and had watched me navigate my family with the patient attention of someone who had his own complicated version, sat across from me at dinner 3 weeks after the reading and said, "What do you think he was trying to say with the trust? With the money for the practice specifically?" I had thought about this. I think he was trying to say he understood what I was building even if he couldn't say so while he was alive. Marcus considered this. "Is that enough for you?" I looked at him honestly. "It's more than I expected. Whether it's enough is a longer question." Marcus nodded. He understood longer questions. He'd been watching me sit with them my whole adult life. My mother called every Sunday. Not because we had always done this, we hadn't. But because after the will reading something in the structure of our contact had shifted slightly, the way furniture shifts in a room after you move one piece. She asked about the practice more specifically than she used to. She asked about the health center project, about the timeline, about whether I needed anything. Once she said, "I want to come see it when it's finished." I said I would let her know when it was ready. She came in the spring. I drove her through the health center on a Thursday morning when it was nearly complete, the construction smell still present, the light coming through the windows the way I had drawn it 2 years before. She walked slowly. She looked at everything. She was not an architect. She had no professional vocabulary for what she was seeing. But she had spent her life around a man who built things and she understood the difference between building and building well. She stopped in the main corridor, which opened into a waiting area designed specifically to feel uninstitutional, natural materials, plants, light, the deliberate absence of the fluorescent and the generic. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "Your father would have been proud. Properly proud. Not the version he showed." I accepted that. Colin called me 6 weeks after the reading. Not to discuss the will or the letter or the money, all of that had been handled through legal channels without conflict, which surprised me and then stopped surprising me when I realized Colin had never actually wanted what the trust represented. He had wanted the business, the company, the tangible legacy. The $800,000 designated for a design practice was not a thing he would have known what to do with. He called to talk about our father. What he said, slowly and in a way that cost him something, was that growing up as the designated heir had its own complications that he had never thought to examine because the designation never felt like a burden, it had felt like identity. The company was his future before he had been old enough to choose a future. He had stepped into it without the discomfort of being excluded and therefore without ever needing to ask whether the shoe fit. The letter made me understand that you had to build yourself from outside the family frame, he said. I never had to do that. I'm not sure whether that made me lucky or just narrower. That was more self-awareness than I had given Colin credit for. More than I had expected. I said, the company is real. What you built with it after Dad's strokes is real. That's not nothing. He said, neither is what you built. Simple. True. The kind of thing that should have been said 20 years ago in the office in Atlanta or 40 years ago at a dinner table in Savannah. But it was being said now, between two men in their 40s who had spent most of their lives on opposite sides of a family definition, and now was better than never. We had dinner in Savannah 2 months later. The four of us, Colin and his wife, my mother, and me. The first meal we had shared since my father's funeral that did not carry the formal weight of grief as its organizing principle. It was imperfect. My mother talked too much about the old house and the old structure of things. Colin reverted a few times to the comfortable patterns of the family hierarchy. I had to catch myself once from retreating into my practiced invisibility when the conversation drifted toward the business, toward Colin's plans, toward the comfortable center of the Hartley universe. Old habits are not enemies exactly. They are just old. You have to choose, each time, to do something different. I chose. I brought the conversation back to the practice. To the library renovation. To the fellowship students and what they were doing. I took up space at that table I had spent my whole childhood not taking because the space didn't feel available. My mother smiled when I talked about the work. Not the performed smile she had used for years to manage social occasions. A real one. Small and slightly late and real. Colin asked good questions. His wife asked better ones. We did not solve everything that evening. We ate dinner and talked and cleared the table and my mother made coffee and Colin's youngest called and he stepped outside and my mother and I sat at the kitchen table in the house on Abercorn Street and she said, very quietly, he loved you, Daniel. He did not know how to show you. I am sorry I did not help him learn. The kitchen was the same as it had always been. The tile was the same. The window above the sink looked out at the same side yard. I said, I know. She said, is that enough? I thought about my letter. About 9 pages written at 16 and carried for 28 years in a portfolio somewhere in that house and read aloud in a law office by a man who had never met me until 4 months ago. About 4 words said at a study window and then set into the legal record so they could not be taken back. I said, it's a start. There is a community health center on the west side of Savannah that opened 6 months ago. It is a 2-story building with a generous footprint, natural materials where the budget allowed, and windows designed to bring light into waiting spaces because waiting spaces, in my experience, are where design either serves people or ignores them, and I have never been interested in ignoring people. The building has my name on a small plaque near the entrance. Not Hartley in the large stone lettering my father might have chosen. Just the firm's name in modest sans serif, the way I've always preferred. Credit without announcement. My mother attended the opening. Colin brought his family. Marcus was there with his wife. Several of the fellowship students who had worked on the project attended. The director of the nonprofit that runs the health center gave a short speech about what it meant to have a building designed for the people using it rather than for the impression of the people funding it. After the formal portion, my mother stood in the waiting area, the same corridor she had stood in during the construction visit, and looked at the finished version. The plants in the corner. The light coming through at the angle I had calculated. The people moving through the space with the particular ease that good design produces without calling attention to itself. She said, he should have come to see this. I said, yes. She looked at me the way people look when they have decided that the true thing is more important than the comfortable one. He would have been proud, Daniel. He was proud. He just couldn't let you see it while he was alive because seeing it would have required admitting he had been wrong about you for 20 years. I looked at her. She said, I knew that. I saw it. I should have named it. I said, you're naming it now. She said, late. I said, yes. She said, but real. I said, yes. But real. We stood in the health center corridor and let the afternoon move through the windows the way I had planned for it to move, and neither of us said anything more for a while, and the silence was the honest kind. The kind that exists between people who have decided to stop managing each other and start being present instead. There is no clean ending to this story because family does not end cleanly. It restructures. It accommodates new information when people are finally willing to carry it. My mother is 72 and learning to say true things in real time. Colin is 47 and expanding the frame of what he considers worth respecting. I am 44 and practicing the daily work of taking up space I spent decades apologizing for occupying. My father died with his letter in a portfolio in his study. He also died with 4 words in the legal record of his estate. People are not one thing. They are the whole accumulated contradictory sum of their choices, and my father was a man who could call a scholarship money for art school and also carry 9 pages for 28 years and also mean it when he said you built something real from a chair by a window while his hands were less steady than they used to be. I don't know how to resolve that completely. I'm not sure resolution is the point. The point might just be this: I wrote the letter at 16 because being honest was worth the risk of being ignored. My father kept it because somewhere underneath the performance of certainty he had built his identity around, there was a man who knew what honesty cost and chose to honor it posthumously when honoring it alive had been more than he could manage. The letter found its way back to me. The 4 words went into the record. And the building on the west side of Savannah has light coming through at the angle I designed it to come through, serving people who did not ask for a monument, just for a room that treated them like their presence mattered. That feels like enough. I read the letter a month after the will reading. I had been home for a long time before I could sit with it. I read it alone, at my drafting table in Atlanta, on a Saturday morning with coffee going cold beside me and the city quiet outside. 9 pages of a 16-year-old's handwriting preserved across almost 3 decades, returned to me in the legal packaging of a distribution clause. I expected it to undo me. It didn't. What it did was something stranger and more useful. It reintroduced me to a version of myself I had worked very hard to outgrow and had perhaps been too efficient about leaving behind. The boy who wrote those pages was frightened and careful and more articulate than he should have been at 16 and absolutely certain, beneath all the careful language, that he was worth more than the space he was being given in that family. He was right. I read all 9 pages without stopping. Some of the language made me wince, the adolescent earnestness, the places where the argument got tangled in its own feeling. But underneath the imperfect language was something true. Not just true for 16. True as an account of what happens when a family's definition of worth is too narrow to include one of its members and nobody is willing to say so until a lawyer in a temperature-controlled room reads it into the permanent record. I folded the pages carefully when I finished. Put them back in the folder Bernard Okafor had given me. Put the folder in the flat file drawer where I keep original drawings. It seemed like the right place. Documents that describe something built. The trust is supporting 3 projects currently. The library renovation opened in October. The fellowship students are good. One of them in particular, a young woman named Priya who is 23 and already thinking about space in ways that take my breath away occasionally, reminds me of the boy at the drafting table in Mr. Galloway's class who was told something exceptional was happening and went home and tried to tell his father. I watch her present her work to the practice and I ask the follow-up questions and I make sure she knows that what she is doing is worth taking seriously. And I do this not as a gesture but because it is the most obvious and available thing I can do with what happened to me. My father said, in the legal record of his estate, you built something real. I build something real every day. I always have. The difference now is that the record says so. My parents cut me out of the narrative of their legacy for most of my life. Then my father sat in a chair by a window with less steady hands and told me the truth. Then he put it in writing. Then a lawyer in Savannah read it in a room where the people who needed to hear it finally had to sit still long enough to listen. My name is Daniel Hartley. I am 44 years old. I run an architecture firm that builds spaces for people who deserve rooms that treat them like they matter. I wrote a letter at 16 that nobody answered for 28 years. When it finally came back to me, it came back as proof. Not that I had been right. That I had been worth it. And that is the thing my father understood, quietly, imperfectly, too late, but completely. That is the thing the letter said. That is the thing the record now shows.